my course objectives were kind of broadly for students to see the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement in the world today, in the U.S., both as citizens and as researchers. So with that, I wanted them to take seriously some of the ways that researchers engage with research questions and selecting research methodologies. So I had kind of this research practical kind of work I wanted them to do in using Black Lives Matter as our cause that we investigated together. And then I wanted them to broadly conceived, and I think after seeing their first day writing responses, very broadly conceived, just understand that there is a lot of value to listening to what this movement is telling us right now. When I started planning this course, had all of my course goals that were, specific to my course theme, which were like 6 of them, mapped out, and I had activities and then assessment and how I was going to check in on all of these things. Once the course got underway, I was really responding to students. Some of the early readings that students did were some basic, kind of long-form journalism pieces about the movement. And knowing what they had written in their first day writing assignments, I really wanted to not immediately get into, some kind of conversation about is this right? Is what are they going for here? So I actually just pulled out some big sheets of paper and asked them if they could draw what the people in these articles were seeing. So if they could even imagine, what was the perspective of the activists that we were reading about? And I kept those sheets of paper, and I brought them back at the end of the semester after everything was done. And I was actually really impressed with their ability to kind of step outside the perspective I was seeing in their early writing and entertain the idea that something was wrong, that something was amiss, and that there were some issues that needed to be addressed. I viewed that, even as just after the very first readings we did, as some measure of progress, at least kind of an openness to, views about this issue that they weren't exposed to before. But I could certainly tell that there was some really good efforts made to really hear from the other side. I had one student who in the class wanted to be a police officer, and so he did his project on All Lives Matter, and he was actually one of the 3 students that decided to do interviews. So he interviewed a friend who had kind of some run-ins with the police, but for very minor things like speeding and that kind of stuff. He interviewed somebody that worked kind of in the back house of the restaurant that he had worked at before, who had a lot more serious run-ins with police officers. He, had been beat up pretty bad by police officers before, and he, in the interview with my student, said, something to effect of All Lives Matter, something like, I don't think that my life matters any more or less than a police officer's life. So that first draft of that paper, I think the student was kind of like, yes, what he said was All Lives Matter, and so that's what we should all agree upon. We have that in common. And then he actually went and interviewed a police officer for his last draft. And the police officer was way more critical of the police force than any of the other 2 interviews he had done. And, he said, basically, it's in our best interest to weed out people who are, disproportionately, following people of color, who are using excessive force. We need to take that very seriously, is essentially the gist he got from there. In that one student, who had kind of really taken a counter stance to what the course was going to present, I think that pushing himself with this methodology that he hadn't used before, using kind of ethnographic interviews, helped him you know, uncover some of the alternative and unexpected perspectives on Black Lives Matter that I think really enriched both the project and I think ultimately, you know, this is somebody who is potentially going to be a police officer someday, you know, his perspective on the perception of police and police's expectations of themselves as well. I was also impressed in the course evaluations that I could tell students understood the value of contextualizing this topic, that it was a worthwhile topic to investigate further and to learn more about, and to not just take what you're seeing in the media. Across the board, I didn't have anybody saying, like, I don't know why we talked about this topic, or we spent way too much time talking about Black Lives Matter, I don't know why that was important. It was pretty consistently, I learned a lot more about this than I knew. My goals for, you know, working with the Black Lives Matter cause were fairly open-ended, you know, like reflect critically on your own attitudes and beliefs about this. But I think that overarching goal of kind of like seeing its importance as a researcher, as a citizen, ended up letting me be a little bit flexible with it. So, you know, in hindsight, what really stands out are some of those moments that really, like, the class seemed to really be challenged or be excited about a different perspective.